They say every woman has a breaking point. For Amara Lewis, it wasn't the betrayal. It was the silence that came before it. The kind that hums inside your chest when you realize you've been living someone else's dream. If this story finds you tonight, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you were too much, stay with me. Because what Amara lost wasn't just a marriage. She lost herself, and then built something unbreakable. And before we begin, if stories of strength, redemption, and quiet revenge speak to you, don't forget to show some love, drop a comment, and follow along. Because what happens next might just remind you of your own power. The Atlanta skyline glowed like molten glass outside the 42nd floor penthouse. Inside, Amara stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, her reflection divided by the city lights, half brilliance, half exhaustion. The night should have been a celebration. Derek's company had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal. The house sparkled, the champagne chilled, the pianist in the corner playing soft jazz. But Amara felt like a prop in someone else's play, dressed perfectly, smiling mechanically, vanishing between sips of champagne. Derek Miles, her husband of 5 years, owned the room the way men like him always do, with loud charm and expensive confidence. He gestured grandly, laughed too hard, shook hands that mattered, and every now and then he looked at Amara the way one might look at a fine painting, with pride, but never connection. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice rich and magnetic, "none of this would be possible without my wife, Amara. She keeps the home beautiful." The crowd chuckled politely. Amara's smile didn't move. He didn't mention she once lectured on architectural history at Emory. Didn't mention her research, her writing, her degrees. Just keeps the home beautiful. The laughter washed over her like cold water. She caught Sabrina Cole's eye across the room, her best friend since grad school, who gave a sympathetic half-smile and raised her glass. But even that felt hollow. Later, when the last guest had left and the house fell quiet, Amara found Derek on the terrace overlooking the glittering sprawl of Atlanta. "You embarrassed me," he said without turning around. She blinked. "By existing? By being distant. People notice when you act ungrateful." I smiled for 4 hours. "Yeah, but not like you used to." He poured himself another drink. "Try harder." She stared at him, trying to remember the man who once read poetry aloud to her on the rooftop of their first apartment. Maybe he never existed. Maybe she'd written that version of him the way she used to write essays, shaping sentences until they resembled meaning. When she returned inside, she caught her reflection in the glass again. The woman staring back at her looked composed, elegant, expensive, but her eyes were flat, like the light had been edited out. That night, Amara sat on the edge of their bed long after Derek had fallen asleep. The city lights spilled across his face, turning him into something both beautiful and cruel. She whispered into the dark, "Who am I when I stop performing for you?" No answer came, only the hum of the city and the slow ticking of the wall clock, marking time, marking loss. In the days that followed, Amara moved like a ghost through her own life. Her mornings began with silence. Her nights ended with wine she didn't enjoy. She'd stopped writing years ago, but now she opened an old notebook. The first page was blank. The second said, in her younger handwriting, "Architecture is the art of survival. Buildings endure what people cannot." She traced the words with her finger. Maybe survival wasn't about staying. Maybe it was about leaving. Derek had a business trip that week. Sabrina called, insisting they meet for lunch. "You've been disappearing," Sabrina teased. "Let's fix that." Amara agreed, unaware that the invitation would lead her to the night that changed everything, the moment her world would collapse just so she could learn how to rebuild it. But that's another chapter. For now, all she knew was this. Something inside her had shifted, something small, quiet, but unstoppable, like the first hairline fracture in glass before it shatters. And if you've ever felt that moment coming, that tremor before your own rebirth, you know it's not destruction. It's the sound of the cage breaking. Morning sunlight slipped through the glass walls like judgment, sharp, uninvited, exposing everything that had been hidden in last night's shadows. Amara stood barefoot on the marble floor of the kitchen, watching coffee swirl in her cup, the liquid black and restless. She used to love mornings. She used to love the smell of roasted beans, the quiet before the city woke. Now, mornings only meant one thing: another day of pretending. Derek entered without a word. Crisp suit, perfect cufflinks, the faint scent of expensive cologne trailing behind him. He didn't look at her, just checked his watch. "You're quiet," she said softly. "I'm focused." "On what?" "On keeping everything running," he replied, still not looking up. "Someone has to." The words slid under her skin like tiny blades. She took a slow breath. "And what am I keeping running, Derek?" He finally looked at her, that same smirk he used when he was trying to win, not love. "You're beautiful. Be that. It's enough." Something inside her shifted again, small but dangerous, like the creak of a structure before collapse. After he left, the silence felt heavier than his presence ever did. Amara opened her laptop for the first time in months. The screen glowed blank, waiting. She stared at the empty document and typed a single line. When a house begins to crack, it never happens all at once. That night, she found the courage to tell him she missed working. Over dinner, she mentioned a position opening at a local museum, curating architectural exhibits. "I could apply," she said, voice steady but hopeful. Derek didn't even let her finish. "No, you don't need to work. It looks desperate when a man's wife does that. People might think I can't provide." "It's not about money." "Then what's it about?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "It's about purpose." He laughed, a sound that used to make her smile. Now, it just echoed. "Your purpose is here, Amara. I thought you understood that." She nodded, but inside, something cracked deeper. Later that week, while he was on another business dinner, Amara found herself sitting in the guest room, her unofficial refuge, surrounded by stacks of books she once taught from. Pages yellowed, margins filled with notes from another life. One line caught her eye, scribbled in pencil. "Architecture fails when it forgets its purpose, to shelter." She whispered the words aloud. To shelter. She realized she hadn't felt sheltered in years. She closed the book and glanced at the clock. Midnight. Derek still wasn't home. She thought about calling, then didn't. Instead, she texted Sabrina. "Can we talk tomorrow? Lunch?" The reply came instantly. "Of course, babe. Miss you. Let's go somewhere nice." Amara smiled faintly. Sabrina always seemed to know when to pull her back from the edge. Or so she believed. When Derek finally came home, his tie undone, his eyes slightly unfocused, she met him at the door. "You've been drinking," she said gently. He shrugged. "Clients. Do they wear Chanel number 5 now?" she asked, her tone almost playful but sharp enough to sting. His jaw tightened. "Careful, Amara." She took a step back. "I'm just asking." "Well, don't," he said. "You're starting to sound paranoid." He walked past her, leaving the scent of perfume and deceit hanging in the air. Amara stood frozen, her hand still resting on the doorframe, pulse drumming in her ears. She didn't cry. Not yet. The tears had dried up long ago, replaced by something colder, clarity. The next morning she woke early. She showered, dressed simply, tied her curls into a knot. She looked in the mirror and saw not a victim, but a woman rehearsing her own resurrection. The fracture lines were visible now, thin, silver, deliberate, and she no longer feared them. Before leaving for lunch with Sabrina, she placed her wedding ring on the counter beside the coffee pot. The diamonds sparkled under the kitchen light, beautiful, but hollow. As she closed the door behind her, she felt it, that first real breath of freedom, fragile but intoxicating. What Amara didn't know was that she was walking straight into the moment her old life would burn. The invitation to lunch, the smile, the celebration, the betrayal waiting, already dressed in red. But not yet. For now, all she could feel was the tremor, that subtle, thrilling vibration of glass before it finally shatters. Rain had rinsed the city clean that morning, leaving the streets of Atlanta glistening like wet glass. The kind of morning that pretends to be peaceful, when in truth, something beneath it is waiting to break. Amara Lewis dressed carefully, not for anyone else, but for herself. A soft cream blouse, tailored trousers, gold hoops that glinted when she turned her head. She hadn't dressed with intention in months. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, she paused. For the first time in a long while, she looked alive. Maybe fragile, but alive. Sabrina Cole chose the restaurant, a sleek rooftop spot downtown where the city hummed beneath the clink of crystal and conversation. When Amara arrived, Sabrina was already there, radiant in scarlet, her laughter too bright for midday. "Finally," she said, standing to hug her. "You look amazing. Marriage must be treating you well." Amara smiled faintly. "Marriage has its seasons." Sabrina grinned, ignoring the shadow behind the words. "Then we drink to the next one." They ordered champagne, and for a moment it felt almost like before Derek's cruelty, before the distance, before the quiet rot that had taken root between the lines of her life. But Amara noticed things now, small things, the way Sabrina's phone lit up every few minutes, how she angled it away when she typed, the flicker of guilt that passed through her eyes before each sip. "So," Sabrina said, leaning forward, "you're coming to the Peachtree Gala, right?" "The what?" "The big one. Saturday night. Everyone who's anyone will be there. I got us on the list." Amara hesitated. "You know Derek doesn't like those events unless he's hosting." "Then don't go for him. Go for you." Sabrina's voice softened, persuasive. "Come on, it'll be fun. Glamorous. Maybe exactly what you need to remember who you are." Amara looked out at the skyline, the buildings piercing the clouds like declarations. She used to love galas, the architecture, the orchestras, the thrill of belonging somewhere that shimmered. Now she mostly watched from the edges. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Don't think," Sabrina replied with a wink. "Just show up." They clinked glasses, the sound sharp and crystalline, a note of foreshadowing no one heard. That night, Amara told Derek about the gala. He didn't even look up from his phone. "You don't need to go. I already told Sabrina I would." He sighed, irritated. "You really think those people care about you? They come to see me, Amara, not you." Her voice stayed calm, but something inside her spine straightened. "Maybe they should." He laughed, that slow, condescending sound that made her skin crawl. "You're cute when you pretend to be rebellious." He left the room. She stood there, frozen in the echo of his laughter. Later, she opened her notebook again and wrote, "Every prison has a door. Most of us are just too conditioned to open it." The words felt dangerous. True. She stared at them for a long time before closing the book and placing it beside her bed like a secret she wasn't ready to say aloud. Saturday came dressed in gold light. Atlanta glittered. The city smelled of magnolias and rain. Amara stood in front of her mirror, the black gown hugging her frame like memory. Elegant, controlled, unapologetic. She painted her lips red, the same shade she used to wear when she still believed in love. When she descended the staircase, Derek looked up from the living room. His expression was unreadable. "Where are you going like that?" "The gala. I told you not to, and I decided otherwise." For a second, he just stared at her. Then he smirked, slow and venomous. "You'll regret it." "Maybe," she said, picking up her clutch, "but regret is better than silence." She left before he could answer. The Peachtree Tower loomed above the city, all glass and grandeur, its chandeliers visible from the street like constellations. Inside, the ballroom shimmered, gold walls, white orchids, violins whispering through the air. Sabrina found her instantly. "You came," she squealed, eyes wide with delight. She looked dazzling, a red silk dress hugging her body like sin. "You look incredible, Amara." "So do you," Amara replied, meaning it. They toasted again, laughing about nothing, their conversation floating above the orchestra like bubbles. For the first hour, Amara felt almost human again, seen, heard, whole. She talked with strangers, smiled at compliments, remembered how it felt to belong to herself. Then the air changed. A shift, subtle, electric. Across the ballroom near the far windows, she saw him, Derek, and beside him, Sabrina. Her arm looped through his hand resting possessively on her back. They were laughing, too close, too practiced. The music didn't stop, but in Amara's chest, everything did. She blinked once, twice, as if her mind could rewrite what her eyes refused to accept. But there it was, undeniable. The man who vowed to protect her, and the woman who swore to stand by her, sharing the kind of smile that only comes from intimacy and deceit. Her glass trembled in her hand. Then, as if obeying gravity's cruelest law, it slipped. The crystal shattered against the marble floor, the sound slicing through the room like thunder. Heads turned, eyes stared. Derek's gaze met hers across the crowd, cold, caught, unbothered. Sabrina's expression flickered between guilt and defiance. Amara didn't move, didn't scream, didn't cry. She just stood there, breathing through the wreckage, her body steady even as her world fell apart. And then she did the most powerful thing she could. She turned and walked away. The sound of breaking glass still echoed long after Amara had left the ballroom. It wasn't just the noise that haunted her. It was what it meant, the end of illusion, the sound of her old life collapsing in public silence. She didn't remember how she got outside, only that the air was suddenly cold and the rain had started again. Soft at first, then insistent. The streets shimmered, neon lights smearing like watercolor through her tears. The hem of her gown clung to her legs, soaked and heavy, but she didn't care. For once, she didn't care how she looked, who saw, or what anyone thought. She had spent years constructing an image, graceful, composed, the perfect wife. But that woman had died the moment she saw them together. All that remained now was truth, and truth was merciless. Somewhere behind her, the ballroom doors opened. Voices rose. She thought she heard Sabrina calling her name, but it didn't matter. Amara kept walking, away from the music, away from the lights, away from everything that used to define her. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She hesitated, then pulled it out. Derek, don't be dramatic. Come back inside. Another message followed almost instantly. Derek, you're embarrassing yourself. Then a third. Derek, we'll talk about this at home. Stop making a scene. A bitter laugh escaped her, sharp and hollow. Even now, it wasn't about her pain. It was about his image. Derek Miles would rather lose a marriage than his reputation. She deleted the messages without replying. Then, for the first time in 5 years, she powered the phone off completely. Rain turned into a downpour as she crossed Peachtree Bridge, the city sprawling beneath her like a sea of glittering indifference. She leaned against the railing, breathing hard, heart pounding in her chest. Somewhere between anger and grief, something new began to take root, a cold, steady clarity. She thought of every time he'd called her ungrateful, every joke made at her expense, every moment he'd stripped her identity down to an accessory. And now, this, her best friend, her husband, together. She whispered into the storm, "You can't break what's already cracked." Lightning flashed above the skyline. For a moment, it illuminated everything. The city, the rain, the streaks of mascara down her cheeks. And in that split second, she saw herself clearly. She wasn't weak. She wasn't broken. She was waking up. By the time she reached the curb, her heels were ruined. She kicked them off, carrying them in her hand like remnants of a costume. A taxi slowed beside her, the driver rolling down the window. "You need a ride, ma'am?" Amara hesitated. Her voice trembled, but her words were sure. "Yes, the Peninsula Hotel." Inside the cab, the world blurred past in streaks of light. Her pulse began to steady. The city outside still pulsed with life, oblivious to the small apocalypse that had just occurred within her. The hotel lobby smelled like lilies and money, too bright, too polished. The clerk glanced up, startled by the woman standing before him, drenched and barefoot, clutching her shoes like a weapon. "I need a room," she said, her tone calm, almost regal. "Under the name Amara Lewis." Not Mrs. Miles, not anymore. The sound of her maiden name spoken aloud felt foreign, but powerful, like reclaiming a birthright she'd forgotten she owned. In the privacy of the hotel room, she peeled off the wet gown, leaving it pooled on the marble like the skin of something she no longer needed. She stood under the shower until the water ran cold, scrubbing away perfume, makeup, the last fingerprints of a life that no longer belonged to her. When she stepped out, wrapped in a robe, her phone blinked to life again. Dozens of missed calls. Voicemails from Derek, from Sabrina. She deleted them all without listening. The silence that followed was strangely peaceful. She sat by the window, watching lightning dance over the skyline, and whispered to herself, "This is the night I stop waiting to be saved." She opened her laptop. The blue light cast a glow over her face, half mourning, half rebirth. She typed in her old email address, the one she'd used before marriage, amllouis.archives@columbia.edu. It still worked. Buried in the inbox were remnants of a life she'd left behind. Articles, academic invites, a message from a professor titled, "We'd still love to have you back if you ever change your mind." She smiled, a small, defiant curve of her lips. Change her mind? Oh, she had. Outside, the rain began to slow, the thunder fading into quiet. Atlanta glistened again, polished and indifferent. But inside that room, a single woman sat awake at 3 a.m. The remnants of her old world scattered around her. The broken dress, the silent phone, the untouched champagne. And in that silence, she began to plan. Not revenge, not yet, something deeper, a rebirth. Because sometimes, before a structure can be rebuilt, it has to collapse completely. By dawn, the city was bathed in gold. The storm had passed. Amara stood by the window, barefoot, watching sunlight spill across the wet streets. Her reflection stared back, tired, raw, but alive. She whispered, "You did it. You walked away." And the woman in the glass whispered back, "Finally." The rain hadn't stopped. It came in slow, steady sheets, falling like time itself, relentless, cleansing, unstoppable. Amara Lewis stood by the window of the hotel suite, watching the storm batter the glass. The city outside glowed faintly beneath the downpour, blurred and unrecognizable, like a painting half washed away. She pressed her palm against the cold pane and whispered to no one, "You made it out." For the first time in years, there was no schedule, no voice calling her name from another room, no need to shrink herself to fit into someone else's frame. Just rain and silence and the hollow ache of freedom. She didn't sleep that night. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Thoughts moved through her like lightning, painful and brilliant. By dawn, she had made a decision. She showered again, dressed simply, jeans, a white blouse, no makeup. The simplicity felt like rebellion. In the mirror, her face was bare, honest, unguarded. She looked like herself again, and that frightened her a little. At the desk, she opened her laptop and began to work through what Derek had left behind. Emails, bank accounts, paper trails. It didn't take long before the truth surfaced. The betrayal went deeper than adultery. He'd been draining their accounts for months, selling assets quietly, moving money into shell companies she'd never heard of. Her fingers tightened on the keyboard. She wasn't angry, not yet. Anger required energy. What she felt was colder, clinical. He hadn't just taken her trust, he'd stolen her foundation. She called the bank, confirmed what she already suspected. Every account tied to her name was nearly empty. Even her savings, the ones she'd started before their marriage, had been siphoned through joint expenses. When she hung up, the silence in the room changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was focused. She poured herself a glass of water, stared at the city beyond the rain, and thought, "So this is who you are, Derek. You don't just destroy love, you bankrupt it." Around noon, her phone buzzed again, vibrating against the glass table. The name on the screen froze her for a moment. Derek. She let it ring, once, twice, 10 times, then silence. A minute later, it rang again. This time, she answered. His voice came sharp and clipped. "Where the hell are you?" "Somewhere dry," she said evenly. "Don't be ridiculous, Amara. We need to talk." "About what?" "The affair or the theft?" He paused. "You're overreacting." "No," she said. "I'm finally reacting." There was a long silence. Then, his voice turned venomous. "You think you can just walk away from me? From us? Everything you have exists because of me." Amara smiled faintly. "Then I guess I'll start building something new. You don't have anything without me." She ended the call. The click of disconnection was the cleanest sound she'd ever heard. That evening, she met with Harriet Dunn, a divorce attorney whose name carried both reverence and fear in Atlanta's elite circles. Harriet's office was high above the city, the storm visible through her windows like a living thing. "I've seen this before," Harriet said after reviewing the documents. Her tone was razor-sharp but not unkind. "Men like Derek don't leave. They drain you until you can't stand, then make it look like your fault." Amara's voice didn't waver. "Can you help me?" "I can do more than that," Harriet replied. "But first, disappear. Don't respond to him. Don't confront him. Let him believe you're broken. Men like him always underestimate silence." Amara nodded slowly. It wasn't vengeance that stirred in her. It was precision. She left Harriet's office with a folder of legal papers and a new sense of gravity. The rain had finally stopped, but the city still glistened, washed raw and shining. Back at the hotel, Amara sat on the bed, the documents spread before her like puzzle pieces. She thought about everything she'd lost: her home, her friends, her name. But as the night deepened, she realized she'd also lost something else: fear. That realization hit like light breaking through storm clouds. She packed only what she needed: her passport, her laptop, her notebook. The rest she left behind. She didn't look back at the gown hanging over the chair, or the heels by the door. Those belonged to someone else now. When she stepped out into the street, the air was damp and clean, the storm's scent still lingering. Taxis hissed through puddles, their reflections slicing the wet asphalt into fragments of light. She lifted her face to the night sky and breathed in deeply. The rain had ended, but it felt as though the world was still trembling with its aftershock. Somewhere behind her, the life she'd built with Derek was crumbling. Ahead, there was only uncertainty, but also possibility. For the first time, Amara wasn't running away. She was walking towards something: freedom. By morning, the rain had lifted, but Amara sensed weather still moving through her. A cold front of clarity, a heat wave of resolve. She spread Harriet Dunn's documents across the hotel desk the way an archivist lays out relics, carefully, reverently, certain that each artifact holds a story and a consequence. She began with numbers, statements, transfers, the tidy logic of theft disguised as joint expenses. The spreadsheet she built was unsentimental. Dates, sums, shells, beneficiaries. The trail of his arrogance glinted like a breadcrumb path for prosecutors. Every time she typed, moved without consent, her hands steadied. Truth is a rail you can hold when the floor is gone. Harriet called at 9:17 a.m. "We will file by end of week. Marital waste, financial misconduct, dissipation of assets, the works. Will it matter?" "It already does," Harriet said. "But you cannot let him bait you. He thrives on reaction. Give him vacancy." "Vacancy," Amara repeated, tasting the word. "I can do that." After the call, she opened a drawer and found the hotel stationery. On the top page, she wrote a headline without thinking: "Blueprint for leaving." Below it, clean steps, numbered and merciless. 1. Secure personal funds. She called her old credit union in Decatur, the one she'd opened as an undergrad, and discovered a small emergency account she'd nearly forgotten. Not much, but honest. Enough for motion, not comfort. 2. Digitize everything. She photographed documents, prenup clauses, will codicils, emails where Derek authorized temporary asset shifts. Each image saved twice, once to a cloud under her maiden name, once to a hardware key she wore on a chain beneath her blouse. 3. Reclaim identity. She ordered a replacement passport in the name that felt like bone: Amara Elise Lewis. She didn't cry when the clerk returned the receipt. She simply tucked it into her wallet like a truth you keep close to the heart. 4. Disappear. Harriet's word, her rule, her shield. When she closed the notebook, she noticed it. Silence that wasn't empty but deliberate, like a museum corridor where sound is a choice. She realized she hadn't checked her phone in hours. She didn't need to. What could Derek say now that wasn't an admission of everything? He did try. Midday, a cascade. "You're overreacting. We can fix this if you stop being dramatic. Come home." Then, uglier: "No one will believe you. I made you. Without me, you're nothing." Then finally, the mask off. "You think anyone wants a woman like you after this?" Amara set the phone down face down and smiled without warmth. The last refuge of a small man is prophecy. He mistakes it for power. No, she said to the empty room. It's projection. She went to the closet and lifted the garment bag that held the ruined gala dress. The silk had dried stiff, rain-salted and unwearable. She folded it once and laid it gently in the trash. A ritual, not a tantrum. Grief doesn't always require flames. Sometimes it requires a clean bin and the courage to close the lid. In the afternoon, she took a rideshare to a storage facility on the city's edge, Unit 12C. She hadn't been there in years. Inside, boxes labeled with the handwriting of a woman who loved ideas more than impressions. Syllabi, research drafts, field notes. She pressed her palm to the cardboard and felt the tremor of recognition. Not nostalgia, but return. She opened a box and found the leather folio from her Emory days. Inside, a photograph she'd taken of a fire-gutted church in Savannah, ribs of timber exposed like a sternum. On the back, her scrawl, "What survives is what was well made and wanted to live." She slid the photo into her wallet. On her way out, a storm began to gather again. Not rain, but evening. Atlanta's sky bruised slowly into violet. She called Harriet from the parking lot. "I'm leaving the city tomorrow." "Good. New York?" "Yes." "I'll file once you're in the air," Harriet said. And Amara, "Yes. Never confuse quiet with surrender. Our silence is strategy." Back at the hotel, she packed a small carry-on, passport, laptop, folio, hardware key, 2 dresses that felt like future, 1 pair of flats that felt like truth. She placed her wedding ring in the room's safe out of habit, then removed it and set it on the desk instead. The metal caught the lamp and threw a thin line of light against the wall. A useful thing once, a liability now. She wrote one more list on the stationery, simple and unsparing. "I am not returning to that house. I am not answering cruelty with performance. I am not negotiating with anyone who benefits from my confusion. I am not small." The night pressed its forehead to the glass. Somewhere, a siren threaded the dark. Amara lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, tracing hairline cracks in the paint that weren't there. She understood at last. The crack she'd been fearing wasn't in her. It was in the story Derek wrote and forced her to live inside. And a cracked story is a blessing. Light gets in. Light gets in. Near midnight, the phone vibrated once more. A new number. She answered on the second ring. "Sabrina," she said before the voice could speak. A breath, then small. "Amara, please, let me explain." "No," Amara said, calm, irrefutable. "Explanation is a luxury we spend on people who protected us. You didn't. It wasn't. It was exactly what it was," Amara said, "and it's over. For both of you." Silence stretched thin, then snapped. Amara ended the call. She stood, drew the curtains open, and let the city's pulse flood the room. Her body ached with the cost of awakening. She placed her hand flat over her heart and felt the steady proof of survival. "You're still here," she murmured. "Now build." At 3:06 a.m., she purchased a one-way ticket to New York. Departure, 10:20 tomorrow. Window seat, no checked bags. Before sleep took her, she set an alarm for dawn and whispered the only prayer she still believed in. "Let me be faithful to the life that wants me." The night held, then softened. In the quiet, the reckoning settled into its final shape. Not vengeance, not spectacle, but architecture. Measured, load-bearing, made to last. The morning came soft and gray, the kind of dawn that made the city look washed and new, as though it too wanted to forget what happened the night before. Amara woke before her alarm, her mind already alert, her heartbeat steady. There was no fear now, just precision. The reckoning had passed. Now came disappearance. She dressed in silence, dark jeans, a beige coat, her hair pulled back in a simple knot. Nothing that would catch attention. Nothing that belonged to the life she was leaving. The Amara who walked out of the Peninsula Hotel that morning was a woman who'd been erased on purpose. A clean slate disguised as ordinary. The air outside was cool and smelled faintly of rain and coffee. She hailed a cab to Hartsfield-Jackson, clutching the small carry-on that held everything she hadn't lost. No luggage tags, No initials, no trace. When the driver asked where she was headed, she answered softly, New York. He nodded, not realizing she meant it as a confession, not a destination. As the cab merged into traffic, she looked out at the skyline she'd once loved. The towers rose like monuments to ambition. Derek's kind of city. Image over substance. Flash over faith. She used to think the glass and steel reflected success. Now, she saw only distortion. For a fleeting moment, her chest tightened. It wasn't love. It was grief. The kind that comes not from losing a person, but from realizing you were never seen by them in the first place. She whispered into the hum of the highway, "Goodbye, Atlanta," and meant it. The airport was a blur of movement and noise. Rolling suitcases, coffee steam, metallic voices calling departures. Amara kept her head low, her stride measured. Harriet's warning echoed in her mind. Don't be visible. Don't give him a target. At the gate, she turned off her phone one last time and slipped the SIM card from its tray. She broke it cleanly in half between her fingers. It made a small, satisfying crack, the sound of severance. When the plane finally lifted from the ground, Amara felt the pull of gravity loosen. The city shrank beneath her, glittering faintly through the clouds, beautiful and merciless. She watched it disappear until all that remained was white sky and the quiet thrum of the engines. She didn't cry, not anymore. The part of her that used to beg for understanding was gone. What remained was elemental. Air, pulse, will. She slept briefly, dreaming of water, standing on a bridge while the rain fell, her reflection rippling and reforming until it wasn't her face at all, but someone new's. When she woke, the sun was rising over the Atlantic horizon, a thin gold line cutting through blue haze. The light hit her skin, soft but certain, and she smiled for the first time in what felt like years. New York met her with noise and wind and possibility. The cab from LaGuardia crawled through Queens, then Manhattan, a labyrinth of glass and old brick, ambition and decay woven together like threads of the same story. Her destination was Washington Heights, a studio apartment she'd found online under a sublet listing with no photos, no questions, and no need for references. When she arrived, the landlady, an older Dominican woman named Marisol, handed her the keys and said simply, "You look like somebody starting over." I like that. The apartment was small, its walls uneven, the paint slightly peeling near the windows, but it was hers. A single chair, a narrow bed, a kitchen that hummed when the fridge turned on. She opened the window, letting in the city noise, car horns, voices, the rhythm of life happening, and she laughed quietly. Not the brittle laugh of survival, but the wild one of rediscovery. She unpacked slowly. Each item had weight. Her passport, identity. Her notebook, blueprint. Her grandmother's pendant, memory. Then, finally, her laptop. She opened it, logged in, and searched her inbox for one name, Professor Ellen Kavanaugh, Columbia University's Architectural Studies Department. There it was, the email she had once ignored, dated years ago. "We'd love to have you join our graduate research team. Your work shows rare insight." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed, "Professor Kavanaugh, this is Amara Lewis. I'm writing to ask if that invitation still stands." She hesitated, then added, "I'm ready to begin again." She hit send before she could lose her nerve. That night, she stood at her window watching the city breathe, taxis below, lights blinking in rhythm with her heartbeat. She thought about Derek, about Sabrina, about the hollow life that had tried to swallow her whole. They would wake up tomorrow believing she was gone, broken, vanished into shame. But Amara wasn't vanishing. She was reappearing, somewhere they couldn't reach, under her own name, on her own terms. Somewhere above the hum of the city, a church bell struck midnight. She whispered, "This time, no one gets to write my story but me." The sound echoed in the room, soft but unyielding, the voice of a woman who had disappeared not to escape, but to evolve. The first morning in New York smelled like rain and ambition. Amara woke to the sound of traffic murmuring below her window, the distant pulse of a city that never apologized for its noise or its hunger. She stood barefoot on the cold wooden floor, feeling the grain beneath her feet, grounding herself in a reality that was completely her own. There were no marble countertops here, no high-rise views, no silk sheets or stage perfection, just chipped paint, a leaky faucet, and a view of the street where people moved with purpose. It was imperfect. It was freedom. She brewed coffee on a small gas stove that hissed like an old friend clearing its throat. As the aroma filled the tiny apartment, she whispered, brick by brick, like a mantra. Her inbox chimed. Professor Ellen Kavanaugh had replied, Amara, I never stopped believing you'd return to the work you were meant for. The timing is poetic. We just opened a new research position. If you're ready, so are we. Come to Columbia tomorrow morning. The message ended with a single line that made Amara's throat tighten. You don't rebuild by erasing the past. You rebuild by understanding what cracked and why. She sat for a long time, staring at those words. Then she closed her eyes and said softly, then let's understand. The next day, the Columbia campus was bathed in sunlight, the kind that made stone look alive. Walking through its gates, Amara felt something she hadn't in years. Belonging. Professor Kavanaugh was exactly as she remembered her. Silver hair, sharp eyes, a mind that cut like glass. When she saw Amara, she smiled, not with surprise, but with certainty. I knew the world hadn't seen the last of you, she said. I almost didn't come back, Amara admitted. Kavanaugh leaned forward. That's the thing about architects. Even when they burn down, they rebuild with intention. The office smelled like old paper and ink. Blueprints were pinned to the walls, lines intersecting like veins. Ellen handed her a folder. We're studying the architectural evolution of Chicago's historic districts, how restoration gives meaning to decay. Chicago. The word struck her chest like a hammer. Of course it would come back to that city, the place where she was built and broken. Amara hesitated. Kavanaugh noticed. You don't have to go, she said gently. But if you ever want to reclaim a city, you start by walking its streets on your own terms. Amara smiled faintly. Then let's walk. Weeks passed, her days filled with archives, maps, and late nights spent sketching designs for preservation projects that balanced history and modernity. Her mind, once dulled by years of emotional erosion, sparked alive again. She rediscovered her rhythm. The hum of creation, the way ideas could become structures, how design could mirror healing. Each drawing was more than work. It was autobiography disguised as architecture. Every brick she traced on paper was a piece of herself being rebuilt. At night, she explored the city, Harlem's murals, Brooklyn's bridges, the poetry of old buildings refusing to collapse. She watched lovers argue and make up on sidewalks, children chase pigeons through puddles, strangers sing on subway platforms. New York was chaos and grace woven together, a living reminder that imperfection could still be beautiful. And slowly, something in her heart began to thaw. One evening, while working late in the campus library, she noticed a shadow pause near her desk. "Excuse me," a deep voice said. "You're Amara Lewis, right? I caught your lecture last week, the one about adaptive restoration. It was extraordinary." She looked up. The man before her was tall, composed, and unfamiliar, but his presence felt deliberate, not invasive. His name, he introduced, was Adrian Cole, founder of a global development firm known for sustainable design. His reputation preceded him: brilliant, driven, impossibly successful. Amara recognized him instantly. Derek used to rant about him, the rival he could never outbid, the man who built beauty instead of bragging about it. Adrian smiled, a hint of warmth in his eyes. "I'd like to discuss a project with you," he said. "It's in Chicago." The word lingered between them. Chicago. Again. A city she had buried in her past, now rising in her present. She met his gaze evenly. "Why me?" "Because your work isn't just technical," Adrian said. "It feels human. You don't restore buildings, you resurrect them." Something in her chest shifted. She had been rebuilding herself in silence, brick by brick, and now the world was beginning to notice. That night, Amara walked home through the city's electric pulse, her reflection flashing across glass windows and puddles. She wasn't running anymore, she was building. Not a new mask, but a foundation. And as she climbed the stairs to her tiny apartment, she whispered again, brick by brick. The words no longer sounded like survival. They sounded like power. For 18 months, Derek Miles told himself he hadn't lost anything. He said it to his reflection every morning, in the mirror of a penthouse that echoed with the kind of silence money couldn't buy back. He told his colleagues that Amara was traveling, that the marriage had ended amicably, that he was refocusing on work. But even lies, when repeated too often, start to sound like prayer, desperate, hollow, and faithless. By the time the truth caught up to him, it wasn't dramatic. It was slow, creeping, a decay that began at the edges of his perfect life. At first, it was the gossip, whispered questions at fundraisers and corporate dinners. "Where's your wife, Derek? She was so poised, so intelligent, such a loss for our foundation's events." He laughed it off with tight smiles and half-truths, but the curiosity never stopped. In circles built on appearance, the absence of a beautiful woman was a public scandal. Then came the investors, the ones who'd once applauded him, who now avoided his calls. Deals stalled. Partnerships dissolved quietly. The whispers had turned into something sharper: financial misconduct, undisclosed transfers, missing funds. Harriet Dunn's legal filings had been methodical, a slow, merciless dissection of his empire. When the papers finally hit his office, the staff pretended not to read them. But everyone knew. Derek Miles, the golden boy of Atlanta real estate, had built his kingdom on sand. The media came next. A headline in the Journal-Constitution: "Former developer faces allegations of fraud amid contentious divorce." And below it, a photograph. Him, leaving his office, expression tight, avoiding the camera flash. For the first time, Derek understood what Amara must have felt that night in the ballroom. The sensation of 1,000 unseen eyes dissecting you. Except hers was humiliation born of betrayal. His was humiliation born of exposure. He'd underestimated her, and the woman she'd become after she walked away. At home, the cracks widened. Sabrina tried to play the part of his savior at first, the supportive lover, the public partner. But the shine wore off quickly when the party stopped and the photographers stopped caring. Their relationship, once thrilling in secrecy, withered under scrutiny. One night, when the creditors' calls wouldn't stop, she packed her bags quietly. "I didn't sign up to drown with you," she said. He didn't stop her. He just watched her go, knowing she was the last person who had still pretended to believe in him. The penthouse grew colder after that. The marble floors Amara once wept on now reflected nothing but shadows. The champagne stains had long faded, but their memory remained, like ghosts refusing to be cleaned away. He drank more, worked less. He told himself he was strategizing, rebuilding, reclaiming. But in truth, Derek was unraveling. Thread by thread, ego by ego. The phone calls became fewer, the emails shorter, the invitations non-existent. Atlanta's elite had a way of quietly erasing the fallen. And soon, Derek Miles was invisible in the city he once commanded. The final blow came not from a courtroom, but from a newspaper feature, a story in Architectural Digest that celebrated a new restoration project in Chicago. A groundbreaking collaboration between the Kostoff Development Group and Columbia University's Architectural Preservation Department. The headline read, "The visionaries behind Chicago's Renaissance, Adrian Cole and Dr. Amara Lewis." Her photograph sat beneath it, poised, confident, radiant. Beside her, Adrian Cole, tall, composed, every inch the man Derek once envied. He stared at the article for nearly an hour, the irony cut deep. The woman he'd dismissed as convenient was now a name the world respected. The rival he'd tried to emulate now stood beside her, not as her conqueror, but as her equal. That was the moment the facade crumbled. Not when he lost the money, not when Sabrina left, but when he realized that Amara hadn't destroyed him. She'd simply outgrown him. And in doing so, she'd revealed what he'd always been: small. Weeks later, the bank seized the penthouse. His cars disappeared, repossessed, quietly before dawn. The staff left, unpaid. He sold his watches, his tailored suits, the life he'd built from performance and pride. He tried calling Amara once, just once, after seeing her photo again in a magazine. The number was disconnected. He stared at the dial tone for a long time before whispering, "You won." But even that wasn't true. She hadn't played his game at all. One rainy evening, Derek walked through the streets of downtown Atlanta, unshaven, coatless, the world moving around him like he'd ceased to exist. He passed the restaurant where he'd once proposed, the hotel where he'd first met Sabrina, the tower whose marble lobby still bore his company's name, though the letters were now faint, the gold dulled with time. He paused beneath it, tracing the engraved letters with his fingertips. Miles Development Group. The name he'd once worshipped like a god. The letters were cold, indifferent, just like the man he used to be. He realized then that this emptiness, was the true consequence of every cruelty, every betrayal, every dismissal he'd handed to the woman who had once loved him enough to stay. Now, no one said his name with admiration. No one looked for him in a crowd. The empire was gone, and so was the audience. Derek Miles had fallen, not in a blaze of glory or scandalous spectacle, but in silence. The same silence Amara had once endured, except she had turned hers into rebirth. He had turned his into ruin. Chicago. The city she once fled now shimmered beneath her airplane window. Silver, sprawling, familiar in the way old wounds are. It had been years since Amara Lewis last saw that skyline, the jagged outline of ambition and memory. But this time, she wasn't arriving as someone's wife. She was arriving as her own name, stamped proudly on conference programs and project blueprints. The city didn't scare her anymore. It had tried to bury her once, but she'd learned to bloom through concrete. When she stepped off the plane, Adrian Cole was waiting near the gate, dressed simply. Charcoal suit, no tie, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He wasn't the kind of man who filled silence with words. He filled it with presence. "Welcome home," he said softly. Amara hesitated at the word home. Chicago had never felt like that before. But when she looked at him, steady, grounded, kind, she realized that home could be a person, not a place. They drove downtown together. The city passed by in snapshots. The Art Institute steps, the glint of Lake Michigan, the high-rises she used to map in her notebooks. Every corner was a ghost, but the ghosts no longer frightened her. "You okay?" Adrian asked. She nodded. "Just remembering who I used to be." He glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "And who is that?" A girl who thought survival was the same as love. He didn't respond, just reached over, briefly touching her hand, grounding her again. The River North Preservation Project was more than architecture. It was redemption made visible. Amara's research had guided every detail, the fusion of history and innovation, the respect for what once was, the faith in what could be. For months, she and Adrian had worked side by side, long nights in conference rooms, coffee-fueled debates, quiet laughter between sketches. But this trip was different. This was the unveiling, her first major public presentation since leaving Derek's shadow. Every word, every diagram, every line of design had been born from her survival. The day before the presentation, Adrian invited her to dinner, not at a lavish restaurant, but a quiet place by the river. They sat near the water, where the city lights rippled and danced. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "you talk about buildings the way most people talk about heartbreak." She laughed softly. "Maybe that's because architecture and love are the same thing. Both start with foundations you think will last forever. And when they don't, then you rebuild. But smarter, stronger. You learn what load-bearing really means." Adrian smiled. "And what have you learned?" "That the right partner doesn't build over you," she said quietly. "He builds with you." He leaned closer, his voice a whisper carried by the wind. "Then let me build with you." Amara didn't answer immediately. She looked out over the river, its surface glinting like memory. "I spent years talking to a man who never listened," she said. "Now, I'm afraid I don't know how to let someone truly hear me." Adrian's reply was simple, deliberate. "Then let me be the man who listens." The next morning, she stood before the Chicago Historical Commission, her presentation projected behind her, the city's past reborn through her vision. Her voice was calm, commanding, magnetic. Every sentence held both intellect and emotion. She spoke of preservation, of resilience, of how structures survive by adapting, not resisting. When the panel voted unanimously to approve the project, the applause felt different from the polite approval she'd once received. This was recognition, not as someone's wife, not as a pretty accessory in a man's success story, but as Amara Lewis, architect, scholar, survivor, creator. Adrian watched from the gallery, his expression unreadable but proud. When she met his eyes, he mouthed just two words, "You did." That evening, they walked again by the Chicago River, the same water that had once reflected her tears. Now, it reflected light. "You faced them all," Adrian said. "You didn't just rebuild this city. You rebuilt yourself." Amara smiled faintly. "I think I just stopped letting other people draw my blueprints." They stopped at the bridge. It was the same one where she'd once stood alone, drenched in rain, broken and discarded. But tonight, she wasn't alone. The city glowed gold in the distance, the water shimmered, and beside her stood a man who didn't try to complete her, only to understand her. She turned to him. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "I thought revenge would feel satisfying, but it doesn't." Adrian nodded. "Because this isn't revenge, Amara. It's evolution." For a long time they said nothing, just stood there, breathing in the sound of the city's pulse. Finally he spoke again. "You were right, you know. Architecture and love are the same." She smiled. "How so?" "Because the strongest ones are built on respect. And maintenance." She laughed, softly this time, the kind of laughter that felt like healing. When they returned to the hotel, she paused at her door, turning to face him. "I don't know where this is going," she said honestly. "You don't have to," Adrian replied. "Just don't run from what's real." And for the first time in years, she didn't. That night, Amara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of Chicago's sleepless rhythm. She thought about everything she'd endured, the betrayal, the silence, the storm. And then she thought of Adrian, the man who didn't try to fix her, who didn't speak over her pain, who didn't ask her to be smaller so he could feel larger. He was the first man who didn't need her silence to feel powerful. He was the man who listened. The city was still humming from the success of the River North project. Every newspaper, every architectural journal, every local broadcast carried the same image. Amara Lewis standing beside Adrian Cole, framed by the restored skylines she'd helped bring back to life. To the world it was a triumph. To her, it was something quieter, deeper, a reclamation of breath. But even in victory, life had a way of testing how much strength truly endured after survival. It started one evening in Adrian's penthouse, the kind of night when conversation melts into honesty. They had spent the day touring the completed site, inspecting the finishing touches before the public unveiling. Amara still had dust on her palms. Adrian had rolled his sleeves to his forearms again, the way he did when he was thinking too much. They stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. The city glowed below them. The same river that once witnessed her breaking now mirrored her return. Adrian turned to her, his voice low, careful. "You know this project doesn't end here." Amara tilted her head. "Meaning?" "I want you to lead the next one. Full creative authority. My firm will fund it. Your designs, your team, your name on every piece of glass and stone." She blinked, unsure she'd heard him correctly. "You'd give me that kind of power?" "I'm not giving it to you," he said. "You already earned it. I'm just making sure the world sees it." The words landed like light through an open ceiling. Beautiful, unexpected, dangerous. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, staring at the offer documents Adrian had sent over. An official proposal, her name bold at the top. Creative Director, Global Heritage Restoration Initiative. It was everything she'd once dreamed of. But her chest ached. She remembered another man who had once made her promises. Different tone, same glitter. "I'll build an empire," Derek had said. "You'll be part of it." But she hadn't been a partner. She'd been a prop. So when Adrian's offer came, generous, world-changing, part of her couldn't tell if it was opportunity or déjà vu. The next morning, she met him for coffee at a small cafe by the Art Institute, the same place where she had once studied facades and symmetry. "You didn't sleep," he said, reading her face easily. Too much thinking. About me? About power, she admitted. And what happens when I say yes? He leaned forward, hands clasped. Amara, this isn't a trap. You know that I know, she said softly, but I also know what happens when women like me stop belonging to themselves. The world doesn't always notice the moment it happens, but I do. Adrian nodded slowly, a small, proud smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That's why I want you to take it. Because you won't let anyone own you again, not even me. The words disarmed her completely, not because they were romantic, but because they were true. Over the following weeks, she threw herself into research, historic preservation models, sustainable urban design, community inclusion. Adrian gave her full autonomy, stepping in only when she invited him. It was strange, exhilarating, terrifying, to be trusted so completely. One afternoon, as she pored over drafts in the Columbia studio, Professor Kavanaugh stopped by. So he offered you the keys to his kingdom, Ellen said, smiling. Amara laughed lightly. Something like that. And what's stopping you? Amara hesitated. Maybe I'm afraid that if I build something this big, I'll lose myself in it again. The professor's expression softened. Then anchor yourself differently this time. Don't build to prove, build to belong, to your own voice. Amara exhaled. You make it sound easy. Nothing worth rebuilding ever is, Ellen said. That night, Amara walked alone along the river, the wind lifting the ends of her hair. The same skyline that once mocked her now bowed in acknowledgement. She thought of how every building she'd studied carried scars, earthquake fractures, smoke damage, weathered stone. And yet, the strongest ones were never the untouched. They were the repaired, the ones that bore proof of having survived. She opened her phone and typed a short message to Adrian. I accept. Then, after a long pause, she added, but only if we build it together, side by side, not one above the other. The reply came almost instantly. That's the only way I'd want it. A year later, the first site broke ground. An abandoned theater in Detroit, a place once filled with jazz and light, now buried in silence and dust. Amara stood at the center of it, hard hat on, blueprints under her arm, eyes alive with vision. She traced her fingers along the cracked walls and whispered, "We'll bring you back." Adrian joined her, the faintest smile on his face. You always talk to your buildings like they can hear you. They can, she said. They just need someone to listen. He looked at her then, the way men look when they finally understand what it means to admire, not possess. And as the first hammer struck, sending echoes through the empty hall, Amara realized something profound. The project, the partnership, even the love that had quietly grown between them. None of it was the culmination of her story. It was the beginning of a new architecture, one designed not from brokenness, but from choice. The theater stood silent, wrapped in dust and memory. Once, it had been the soul of Detroit's music district. Velvet seats, brass railings, a chandelier that once shimmered like captured starlight. Now, it was a husk. The roof leaked, the stage sagged. The air carried the faint sweetness of decay. Amara Lewis stood in the center of the ruined hall, light slanting through shattered windows, and whispered, "You're still beautiful." Adrian Cole watched from the doorway, hands in his pockets, quietly letting her speak to the walls like old friends. "You really believe this place can live again?" he asked. Amara smiled faintly. It never stopped living. It just stopped being seen. That was how she saw everything now. Architecture, people, herself. Restoration wasn't about erasing damage. It was about honoring what had survived. The project consumed them both. Days blurred into nights filled with sketches, debates, and blueprints spread across tabletops like maps of possibility. The theater's skeleton slowly revealed its secrets. Carved motifs beneath grime, murals faded but intact, echoes of the applause that once filled the hall. Adrian handled the logistics, the politics, the investors. Amara handled the soul. Together they became a rhythm, a partnership measured not in romance but in purpose. Yet under that purpose something tender grew, unspoken but alive. There were moments when their hands brushed over the same blueprint, when their laughter filled the empty lobby, when silence between them felt thick with everything unsaid. Amara didn't run from it. Not this time. She'd spent years mistaking attention for love and control for care. But with Adrian, love felt like space. Wide, breathable, sacred. One evening, after a 12-hour shift on site, they climbed to the balcony level to watch the sunset through the broken roof. The sky bled gold and violet through the jagged glass. "You ever think," Amara said softly, "that some things are meant to fall apart before they can be built right?" Adrian turned to her, resting his forearms on the railing. "Only every day. My father used to say, failure isn't the opposite of success. It's the rehearsal." She smiled, studying his face in the fading light. "You really do listen." "Always," he replied. Then, after a pause, "Even when you're quiet." For a long moment, they just stood there. Two people who'd lost everything once, daring to imagine they could build something lasting again. As weeks passed, word spread about the restoration. The city buzzed with anticipation. Donors returned, journalists arrived, and crews worked tirelessly to bring life back to the building's bones. But not everyone was rooting for them. Derek Miles, now a whisper in the industry, reappeared in the press, bitter and flailing. He called her success theatrical feminism, accused her of stealing his ideas, of manipulating investors. His words were desperate, but they found traction with tabloids hungry for scandal. When Adrian showed her the article, Amara didn't flinch. She only said, "Let him talk." "That's all he has left," Adrian nodded. "Still, it's your name on the line." "It's fine," she said. "Truth doesn't need defending. It just keeps standing." And it did. Because when the restoration was complete and the chandeliers lit the theater again for the first time in decades, the truth was undeniable. It wasn't a comeback story, it was a resurrection. On opening night, the air trembled with music and applause. The orchestra played beneath golden light, the walls pulsed with life, and Amara stood on stage in a sleek black gown, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as proof of endurance. Adrian stood in the wings, watching her. She caught his gaze and smiled. Not shyly, not performatively, but with the quiet certainty of someone who finally understood her own worth. When the crowd stood in ovation, the sounds shook the room. The applause wasn't just for the building, it was for her, the woman who'd rebuilt more than architecture, the woman who'd learned that restoration begins within. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the lights dimmed to gold, Amara walked alone across the empty stage. The sound of her heels echoed softly against the floorboards. Adrian followed, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "To the theater," he said. "To survival," she countered, clinking her glass to his. He looked at her then, something unguarded in his eyes. "You know, Amara, every time I walk into a space you've touched, I swear I can hear it breathing again." She smiled. "That's because I build for people who've forgotten how to exhale." He set his glass down and stepped closer, his voice low. "And what about you? Have you learned how to exhale?" For a heartbeat, she said nothing. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. Then she reached up, brushed a speck of dust from his lapel, and whispered, "Finally." He kissed her, slow, certain, reverent, not as a rescue, but as a recognition. When they pulled apart, the theater lights flickered softly, casting long shadows across the restored floor. Amara looked around and felt something shift inside her. Not joy, not relief, something steadier, peace. She realized then that restoration wasn't about returning to what was lost. It was about becoming who you were always meant to be before the damage began. Atlanta waited for her like an ex-lover, the kind that smiled when you came back but hid bruises beneath the grin. It had been 3 years since Amara Lewis had last seen the city skyline rise out of the haze, sharp and unforgiving. The plane descended through soft clouds, and for a moment, she thought she could hear echoes of her old life in the rumble. Champagne laughter, broken promises, a door closing too hard. But this time, she wasn't coming home to beg for peace. She was coming to reclaim the ground where she'd first learned how to walk away. The invitation had come from the Atlanta Preservation Society, a keynote request. They wanted Dr. Amara Lewis, the architect behind Detroit's reborn Rialto Theater, to speak about restoration as a metaphor for the human spirit. The irony was delicious. The same city that once whispered about her scandal now wanted to hear her wisdom. Adrian Cole had offered to come with her, but she'd refused gently. "This one," she said, "I need to face alone." He didn't argue. He only kissed her forehead and said, "Then I'll be waiting when you come back." That, she realized, was love, not possession, but permission. Her car rolled through familiar streets, the ones she'd once driven in silence beside Derek Miles, pretending not to notice the scent of someone else's perfume. Now, she saw them differently. The skyline, the cafes, the downtown glow. They weren't reminders of who she'd been, but proof of how far she'd come. She checked into a boutique hotel near Peachtree Street. The view overlooked the very district where her old penthouse still stood, glass and arrogance glinting in the distance. Somewhere up there, her past was collecting dust. That evening, she walked through the city alone. The air was heavy with southern summer, magnolia sweet and electric. She passed the restaurant where she and Sabrina once laughed over wine. The laughter felt foreign now, like it belonged to strangers. When she reached the bridge where she'd once stood in the rain, the night her life had cracked open, she paused. The city lights shimmered on the water. She whispered to the wind, "Thank you for breaking me. I needed to know what I was made of." And in the stillness, for the first time, she felt no anger, no bitterness, just gratitude for her own endurance. The next day, the conference buzzed with anticipation. The grand ballroom was filled with city officials, developers, and journalists, the same kind of people who once dismissed her. When Amara stepped onto the stage, the audience hushed. She wore a tailored navy suit and confidence like silk. She began simply. "Restoration," she said, "isn't about making things look new again. It's about honoring what refused to die." She spoke of buildings and people, of decay and endurance, of how healing wasn't about perfection, but persistence. Her voice was calm, deliberate, magnetic. Every sentence felt carved from experience, every pause heavy with meaning. By the time she finished, the room erupted in applause. The sound washed over her like light, not blinding but warm. After the speech, there was a reception. People clustered around her, offering praise and handshakes. But amid the swirl of congratulations, she noticed him. Derek Miles. He stood near the bar, older, thinner, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit anymore. His confidence had curdled into something brittle. The crowd seemed to avoid him instinctively, like the air itself knew his story. Their eyes met across the room. The world seemed to go quiet. He approached, hesitant, a man rehearsing humility. "Amara," he said softly, "you look incredible." She smiled faintly. "Hello, Derek." For a moment, neither spoke. Then he sighed, a sound caught between regret and exhaustion. "I saw the theater opening. You did it. You really did." "I did," she said. "Without you." The words weren't cruel, just factual. He swallowed hard. "I was an idiot. I know. I didn't realize what I had until I stopped being convenient," she finished gently. He winced. "I deserved that." "No," she said quietly. "You deserved the chance to be better. But you wasted it." He looked at her then, eyes wet, voice low. "You ever think we could have fixed it?" Amara's gaze softened, not with affection but compassion. "We were never broken, Derek. We were misbuilt. You can't fix a house that was designed to collapse." He opened his mouth to say something else, but she placed a hand on his arm. Not as forgiveness, but farewell. "I hope you find peace," she said, "but it won't be in my story anymore." And with that, she turned and walked away. That night, Amara stood again on her hotel balcony. The city glittered below. The same city that once swallowed her whole now glowed like an old photograph restored to color. Her phone buzzed. A message from Adrian. "How did it go?" She typed back, "I faced the ruins. They didn't scare me." Then, after a pause, "I'm coming home." She looked out one last time at Atlanta, the city of betrayal, the birthplace of her awakening, and smiled. It had taken years, storms and silence, but she finally understood. Some places you don't return to for closure. You return to prove that they no longer have power over you. Love, Amara had learned, is not the chandelier that makes a room gasp. It's the beam you never see, the quiet line that refuses to bow when weather turns. After Atlanta, The noise faded and the work resumed. Detroit humming again, New York tugging at her sleeves, Chicago breathing like a city finally forgiven. And between those cities, a life began to take shape with Adrian Cole. Not spectacle, structure. They moved carefully, as if carrying stained glass between them. Weekdays were blueprints and boardrooms. Nights were soup in chipped bowls and music played low, the kind you can talk over. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Sometimes they let silence say everything. He did not fill her pauses with answers. He waited until she chose a word, then built around it. On a rain-laced Tuesday, she woke to the sound of his voice reading from her notes, a line she'd scribbled at midnight and forgotten. "Restoration isn't a return," he read, smiling. "It's an arrival." He set the page down like something sacred. "This is what you do to buildings and what you did to me." There were small tests. A journalist tried to bait her into crediting Adrian for what was hers. She answered, steady. "He doesn't take my voice. He amplifies it." A board member suggested she soften her stance on community oversight. Adrian spoke first. "Her boundaries are part of the design," and the matter ended. When an investor praised Adrian and thanked his lovely partner for helping, Amara only raised an eyebrow. Adrian laughed. "She's not helping," he said, delight sharp and clear. "She's leading." Still, love brings its own tremors, the hairline kind you can ignore until a storm finds them. One evening in Harlem, jazz through the window and thunder brooding over the river, Adrian found her staring at the door longer than necessary. "You're hovering," he said softly. "I'm measuring," she replied. "The distance between who I was and who I am when I let someone in." He stepped back, literally, giving her space as if space itself were a gift. "We can leave it open," he said, "or install hinges that don't squeal. Your door, your call." She laughed, a small sound that felt like light. "You turn everything into architecture." "You turn me into a home," he said, almost shy. "I'm only keeping up." Days later, a letter arrived from a South Atlanta community group, handwritten and careful. "Because of your talk, our girls started a sketch club. They're drawing the places that made them and the places they want to make." Attached was a photograph, 10 girls in oversized t-shirts, grinning, holding paper cities. Amara cried without apology. Adrian didn't tell her not to. He brought a box of tissues, then framed the photo. "Let's build for them," he said, "not at them, for them." In the months that followed, they designed a program together. Studios in underfunded schools, pop-up labs in abandoned storefronts, stipends for young women who thought architect was a word reserved for men in glossy magazines. They called it Open Foundation because closed doors had nearly cost Amara her life. The tagline, hers: "We teach you the rules so you can redraw them." One night, long after midnight, she found Adrian at the dining table, not wearing a suit, but the concentration she loved. He drafted a document, its title simple, Articles of Us. He slid it to her, careful, like a fragile artifact. "I'm not asking a question," he said, nervousness brightening his eyes. "Not yet. I'm offering terms. If we build anything further, house, marriage, chaos, we build it on these." She read, hand steady, autonomy clause. "Your work, name, and intellectual property remain yours, always." Silence clause. "We resolve conflict in rooms, not on battlefields. No Cold Wars. Maintenance schedule. Quarterly check-ins. Not performance reviews, heart reviews. What's cracking? What needs light? Consent to change. We honor the person the other is becoming, not the statue we met. Exit plan. If we ever must part, we leave the door clean. No salt in the soil." He swallowed. "I never want you to mistake love for ownership again. Not mine. Not anyone's." Amara felt a tenderness so fierce it bordered on ache. "You wrote a prenup for freedom." "I wrote a foundation," he corrected, voice low, "so the chandelier can be ridiculous." She signed her name first, not because she doubted him, but because she trusted herself. He signed after, then tucked the papers into a simple linen envelope and placed it on the shelf beside the girl's photograph. 2 artifacts, 1 promise. They traveled to Detroit to walk the theater at dawn, to Chicago to stand beneath the winking river lights, to New York rooftops where the city rose around them like a verdict overturned. In each place, they found rituals, touching stone before entering, naming 3 things they were thankful for before sleep, leaving notes in the margins of each other's mornings. When she was afraid, she said so. When he was, he did too. They confessed not to erase fear, but to invite it into the light, where it could not grow fangs. One afternoon, they visited a brownstone for sale in Brooklyn, sun pooling on the floor like mercy. The place needed everything. Joists trued, brick repointed, a spine. Adrian watched Amara move through rooms, palm on walls, listening as if to a patient's breath. "What do you hear?" he asked. "History asking for a future," she said, "and a future that refuses to forget its history." They didn't make an offer. Not yet. Instead, they chalked a small heart inside the basement wall, a builder's blessing, then left the key with the agent and the dream with the house. Some places you buy, some places you let choose you. In quiet hours, the past still knocked, Derek's name in an article, a stranger's careless comment. But those knocks no longer rattled the frame. The frame was new, built with better timber, anchored to bedrock. On a late autumn evening, the city wearing its first glitter of cold, they hosted a small gathering in Amara's studio. Students, colleagues, the girls from Atlanta now visiting, taller, louder, carrying sketchbooks filled with impossible bridges. Professor Kavanaugh raised a glass. "To structures that stand," she said, eyes bright, "and to the women who teach them how." After the room emptied and the lights dimmed, Adrian took Amara's hand and led her to the center of the floor. No music played. He swayed anyway. She rested her cheek against his shoulder and counted his breath. "This," she murmured, "is the part of the story no one teaches. How to stay when staying is safe. How to trust when no one is asking you to disappear." He held her a little closer. "We'll write that chapter." "We are," she whispered, and knew it was true. Love, at last, was not an earthquake but a code. Respect in the footings, care in the cross-bracing, choice in every joint. Outside, the city blinked, alive and imperfect. Inside, 2 people kept building, slowly, stubbornly, beautifully, proving what Amara had always known, but needed to live to believe. The most enduring architecture is built on consent, tended with maintenance and measured not by height, but by how gently it shelters the lives within. Years later, the city skylines she once feared to face now carried her name etched into their light. Dr. Amara Lewis, architect, educator, survivor, builder of what lasts. Her story had become more than a headline or a comeback. It was a map, a testament to the art of rebuilding, not just structures, but the human spirit itself. The open foundation had grown beyond anything she and Adrian imagined. What began as a single studio in Atlanta had blossomed into a movement. Architectural workshops in schools across the country, scholarships for young women of color in design, mentorship programs in cities that had once written them off as invisible. Everywhere Amara went, she found echoes of the girl she used to be, wide-eyed, brilliant, waiting for permission to take up space. Now she was the one handing out the blueprints to freedom. On a crisp autumn morning, she stood in the grand atrium of Columbia University's new design center. Sunlight spilled across the marble floor, catching the gold lettering on the wall. "Restoration is not a return, it's an arrival. Amara Lewis." Students streamed past, some whispering her name, some unaware they were walking through history she'd helped build. She didn't need recognition. The legacy was already alive in every blueprint drafted by hands that once trembled with doubt. Adrian approached from behind, his voice soft. "They still quote you more than me." She smiled. "That's because I say fewer words but mean every one." He laughed quietly, slipping his hand into hers. The gesture was familiar, grounding. "We're meeting with the board in 10 minutes, he said. "You ready?" She looked at him, then at the sunlight streaking the room. "I've been ready for years. I just didn't know it." The presentation that morning wasn't about another building. It was about legacy. They unveiled the Solace Project, a global initiative to restore community centers, libraries, and forgotten landmarks across continents scarred by neglect. Amara spoke first. Her voice carried the same strength that once silenced ballrooms. "We're not just preserving architecture," she said. "We're preserving memory. Every wall we rebuild tells someone they mattered. Every space we open gives the next generation room to dream." The audience rose in applause before she even finished. Adrian looked at her, not as a man proud of his partner's success, but as someone in awe of the world she had reimagined. That night, they returned to their brownstone, the one they had finally chosen and rebuilt together. The walls bore pieces of their journey, photos of the theater in Detroit, sketches from Chicago, a framed newspaper clipping from Atlanta titled, "The Woman Who Redefined Restoration." Amara stood at the window, watching the city glow under a soft drizzle. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked quietly. Adrian turned. "Who?" "The woman I used to be." He stepped closer, brushing her shoulder. "Every day. And I thank her for surviving long enough to become this one." She smiled, a tear slipping free, but it wasn't sadness, it was recognition. For the first time, she saw the full circle of her life not as rise and fall, but as evolution. Months later, she returned to Atlanta again, this time not to confront ghosts, but to lay a foundation. The Amara Lewis Center for Resilient Design broke ground where her old penthouse once stood. The marble tower was gone, replaced by open glass and gardens, classrooms filled with students sketching their first dreams. At the ceremony, she stood before the crowd, holding the same pendant her grandmother had once given her, the only piece of jewelry she hadn't pawned during the dark years. She touched it, then began to speak. "When I was younger," she said, "I thought strength meant never breaking. But I've learned that the most powerful structures are the ones that crack and still stand." She looked out over the audience. Students, builders, dreamers, daughters of women who had been told to be smaller. "You are not ruins," she continued. "You are blueprints. You are the foundation of what comes next." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was reverent, because everyone in that crowd knew they were witnessing more than a dedication. They were witnessing proof that survival could become strategy. That evening, as the city lights flickered to life, Amara walked barefoot through the courtyard of the center. The grass was damp, the air thick with the smell of rain and concrete. She tilted her face upward, eyes closed, whispering a thank you, to the pain, to the silence, to every version of herself that refused to disappear. Adrian joined her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "You did it," he said. She shook her head gently. "We did it. And so did every woman who decided she was enough, long before the world agreed." Years from now, her story would be told in classrooms, shared on screens, whispered between women standing on the edges of their own breaking points. Some would call it resilience. Others would call it revenge made graceful. But Amara knew the truth. It was restoration, not of the buildings, of the self. So if you're listening now, if your world has cracked, if you've been told you're too much or not enough, remember this. You don't have to rebuild the same version of yourself that broke. You can create something entirely new, something stronger, more beautiful, more you. Start with one brick, one choice, one breath, then another, and another. Because the legacy of Amara Lewis isn't that she survived, it's that she built, and so can you. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that broken doesn't mean finished. Somewhere, someone is waiting for proof that it's still possible to rise, and you can be that proof.